Wow, thank you all for coming here. I hope you didn't think I was going to serve all of you. If you did, I think you better go home. No, seriously, I'm very happy that you're here today. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. It's especially wonderful for me because you're here celebrating my birthday. So I can't think of a better place to be than with all of you talking about seafood and sea vegetables, and also being able to do some cooking along the way. So let's get started. The highlights of this talk are we're going to talk about how to choose seafood, and also we're going to introduce you to sea vegetables if you're not familiar with them. They're also known as seaweeds. And we'll be talking about how sea vegetables are cultured. And then in between all of that, we're going to also have a cooking demonstration. So before we get started, first of all, how many of you eat seafood? How many of you don't eat seafood then? Okay, so very good. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to ask you some questions. And if you would raise your hand and let me know whether or not these are some of your concerns. When you're going to buy seafood, let's say at a seafood market or at a restaurant or at the supermarket, what do you think about? And you can use your left hand or your right hand. You can alternate it so you can get a little exercise in there too. And I'm not counting. I just want to kind of have a feel of what you're thinking about. So how many of you judge, and by the way, you can vote more than once. How many of you are concerned about the freshness and quality when you're buying seafood? Okay, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. How about the price? How about how it's going to taste? Okay, good. How about the preparation? That would be more, well, you could buy like value added, or you could be at a restaurant and maybe you'd order something because of the way it's been served. So is preparation an important part? Right? When you're choosing seafood, do you think of the healthy factor of seafood and the nutritional value? Okay. Do you think about food safety and any contaminants when you're choosing your seafood? Okay. Do you think about the sustainability of the fisheries or the sustainability of how the fish or shellfish or shrimp was grown before you make a selection on seafood? So some of you do, right? Well, today we're going to learn a little more about that. And then the last question I have for you is, do you choose seafood based on where it's from in the world, or if it's aquacultured or wild caught? Okay, good. We've got a pretty good informed audience here. So every other year, there's a group called Seafood Business. They put out a really good magazine. They do a survey, and they do a survey of restaurant buyers, say what their customers are concerned about. So you can see some of the results here are very similar to the concerns that you all have. And you can see here on the axis over here to the left, you can see this is the percentage of people that have these concerns, and then at the bottom are the different criteria that we just discussed. So you can see that, of course, freshness, price, etc., but health and food safety and others weren't quite as high. So we're going to focus on those today because, well, actually, we're going to do a little preparation too, but we're really going to focus so that you can understand a little bit more about health, about sustainability, how to make more wise choices. Food safety, we're going to talk about contaminants, and then other is going to be more aquaculture. And so it's kind of interesting that none of the concerns up here are whether or not it was wild raised or wild caught or farm raised. So first of all, let me orient you to the state of the fisheries and also how much aquaculture is playing a very important role in fisheries. So first of all, along the y-axis here, the vertical axis, that's millions of tons of seafood, okay, from 0 to 160. Across the bottom axis is the year, okay, starting in 1950 all the way out to 2010. So the light blue is captured fisheries, and the dark blue is aquaculture. So overall, all of fisheries combined, aquaculture and also wild, it's about 154 million tons of seafood that's consumed on an annual basis. That's a lot of seafood. If you want to visualize a ton, think of a Volkswagen. It's about a ton and a half. Okay, so that would be 154 million Volkswagens worth of seafood. It's a lot. So back in the 80s, is pretty much late 80s, early 90s, seafood from the oceans pretty much reached a plateau. That means that you're still fishing the same amount from the sea, but it's probably different species than there were before, and it's pretty much where you can't find much more protein. And right now, about 70% of all the seafood is either overfished or it's exploited. And so aquaculture, back in the 50s, was a very small percentage of the seafood that we ate. I became interested in aquaculture in the 1970s. That's when I first started working with the Queen Conch. I knew then that there needed to be more aquaculture. And so I've pretty much devoted my career to aquaculture. So it was really in the 80s when you started to see the plateau, or the early 90s, that you start to see this incredible increase of aquaculture. And today, aquaculture is 42% of the seafood that we consume. And overall, aquaculture is 50%. If you include all the aquatic plants and also the ornamental fish and things like that, it's about 50%. It's going up very quickly. So this is a very interesting bit of information. So I told you that there's 154 million tons of seafood harvested, or that's consumed. And so I wanted to show you sort of the breakout. If you look at inland, means freshwater. And so if you look at inland for fisheries, fisheries is 90 million tons of the 154. There's very little that comes from freshwater. The majority is saltwater, which makes sense because that's where the wide variety of seafood is. Then if you look at aquaculture, which is 64 tons of the 154, it's the reverse. There's more freshwater. You're going to have well, I'm going to name those off in a little bit. But there's little in marine. And I'm not going to say little because 31% is still a large percentage. But I think it's very interesting to look at this, because what we're saying is as the wild population starts to decrease or get overfished, we need to culture more and more of our favorite marine products. And there's only so many that are cultured these days. Not all of your favorite seafood is cultured yet. And just so you know, it can take sometimes 10 to 20 years for a new species to come on. So I project for the future that we might not have all of our favorite seafoods, and that our shift in seafood tastes may change over the course of time until these new marine products start to catch up through aquaculture. So you might be wondering, well, where in the world is all this aquaculture coming from? And it's very clear. You can see that Asia is number one. 89% of all the aquaculture is from Asia. China is producing 61% of it. In the Americas, North America is about 1.1%, and actually the United States is less than 1% of aquaculture. We produce about 500,000 tons of seafood, but we consume, as a nation, we consume about 7 million tons. So that means that we're importing about 85% of the seafood that we eat. And of that, about 50% is. So my message here is we got to get going and produce more aquaculture species here in the United States. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor of the types of seafood that are grown, and this is not just in the US, but it's also in other parts of the world. But you're looking at your freshwater species are going to be your tilapia and your catfish, also your trout, your saltwater or more your salmon, and also your shrimp, clams, oysters, mussels, seaweeds. And there's lots of other different types of animals or organisms grown around the world. They grow frogs, and they grow sea cucumbers and urchins. But there's also species like pompano and cobia. And so there's a wide number of species that are cultured. I believe it's around 600 different species are cultured in 190 countries. So how much seafood are people eating? Over the last 5 decades, it's increased considerably. If you look at 1960s, 22 pounds of seafood per person was eaten. Now the world average is closer to 40, so we've doubled in the last decade. So of course, part of that is that there's more population. So that's, but that doesn't really answer the per capita, the per person. And so the thing is that more people are aware that seafood's healthy for you, and distribution is easier. It's easier to get seafood anywhere in the world now, so more people can eat it. So it's interesting if you look at this map here, the black area at the top is Greenland. They're eating the most amount of seafood per capita, close to 120 pounds a year. Then if you look at China is the next highest consumer along with Norway, Sweden, Finland, Spain, right? They're eating close to 60 to 120 pounds. And then the United States, North America here, and Australia, Russia, on the average, it's around 40 to 60, because those are in kilograms, so I'm just converting it for you. So that gives you an idea of sort of where the seafood is. And a lot of that's going to depend on geographics, you know, what seafood is available near your shore, how easy it is, how much it's being cultured, how easy it is to bring it into the area. So that's pretty much how you see the outlay there. Okay. So now we're going to give you some tips. So the next time you're at the seafood counter, you can have some more tips on what you'd like to help you to know when you go to choose your seafood. And I've invited one of my colleagues, Adam Schaefer, who's our resident epidemiologist. And he's going to come up and talk to you about one of the contaminants that you should be aware of when you're choosing your seafood, and a little bit more information on that. So I'm going to turn this over to Adam. I'll be back.
Thanks, Megan. So one of the issues when it comes to choosing which seafood to eat are contaminants. And I'm going to pull out the one contaminant that tends to get the most attention and I know a little bit more about, and that's mercury. And the first question I usually get is, where the heck does the mercury come from and how does it get into the fish? And hopefully this slide kind of sort of answers that question. Now there's a lot of sources for mercury getting in initially to the atmosphere, and that primarily comes from burning of coal, and some mining operations, and even waste incineration. Now once the mercury gets into the atmosphere and becomes particle bound, it can actually travel over large geographical areas before it gets deposited, in this case, into a marine environment. And something really important happens in a marine environment, and that's this methylation step. And that's where certain kinds of bacteria biotransform mercury into the harmful form of mercury known as methylmercury. And it'll eventually cross biological membranes and accumulate in the food web. An important concept is biomagnification, and that means that the critters at the top of the food web, the apex predator, will have a higher concentration of mercury than at the base of the food web because they eat everything else beneath them. So eventually, the higher trophic level fish are the ones that have the higher concentration of mercury, and that's something important to remember as we go on. And a great example of that accumulation or magnification comes with some of our dolphin work here at Harbor Branch, where we've seen dolphins with some of the highest concentrations of mercury in their blood and their skin, right here in the middle, compared to populations in other areas. This is a dramatic example, and it's led to a whole lot of other lines of research done at Harbor Branch, so I'm going to plug the work I do a little bit here, where we use dolphins as a sentinel for the health of the ecosystem and kind of an indicator species of what's going on beneath them in the food web. And as you can see with the mercury example, it's quite dramatic. And it's led to multiple lines of study where we've looked at some of the overall health effects and physiological effects that mercury is having on these species. So it's led to some other questions about what's going on in the environment and what's the risk to human health. So we've actually started a human sampling project that's been going on for a couple years now, where we've looked at and tried to correlate the mercury concentration of local residents in relation to their consumption of local seafood, both the frequency of what they're eating and the individual species and where it's coming from. And we're doing this human work because of the multiple known health effects when it comes to being exposed to mercury. Now, the most dramatic example occurred back in the 50s in Minamata Bay, and that's where a company dumped large amounts of mercury, which hopefully wouldn't happen today, into the bay, and it started to accumulate, and they saw some very severe and acute health effects in the local population. Those things ranged from neural impairment, vision, slurred speech, and even ataxia, where they were having a disturbed sensation in their extremities. But that's really kind of a rare, very dramatic example, but that's not really how most people are exposed to mercury. It usually comes through chronic, long-term, low-level exposure. And a great example of that is actually when mercury was used in the felting process of hats. Now, eventually, the hat makers were exposed to accumulating levels of mercury over time, and that's where the term mad as a hatter originally came from. But again, we're not using mercury in hats anymore, at least hopefully not. In more industrialized areas, exposure to mercury primarily comes from the consumption of seafood. And the real at-risk population aren't necessarily healthy adults, but developing fetuses, potentially pregnant females, and young children. And those effects have been shown in multiple studies in the Seychelles and Faroe Islands, where they've seen delays in development of motor skills, language, and even some cognitive thinking deficits. So that's where we're really concerned when it comes to high concentrations of mercury in seafood. So now that I've scared you away from eating seafood, it's not all bad. And in fact, we're not saying you shouldn't eat seafood. We do know that eating fish has a lot of health effects, and it's a lot better than avoiding certain species. But what we want to give you is kind of a tool in terms of what species to eat and what to avoid. And it's just like anything that you're putting in your body. It's about frequency and being a really educated consumer. So up here we have a listing of some of the higher mercury concentration species. These are the kinds of fish you want to eat maybe a couple times a month or avoid if you're a pregnant female. We also have some of these animals on the lower spectrum that you can have more often, both in farm-raised and wild-caught fish. But you don't have to worry about trying to memorize this list. Megan's actually going to give you some other tools in terms of education and wherever Megan went to, maybe she ran off, in terms of what seafood to eat and how often.
Thank you, Adam, very much. That's great. Okay, so that's some very important information. And when you leave today, on both ends of the podium here, we have some seafood guides so that you'll be able to look and be able to take those with you as a handy guide when you go shopping. So you might be wondering, actually, how do these guides actually come to be? How do they make the analysis of best to eat, a good alternative, or don't eat? And so for the fisheries side of things, they look at the vulnerability of the species themselves, the status of the stock, how stable is the stock, is there a bycatch when they're fishing the fish? You've heard of trawlers, there's a lot of bycatches, or long lines, there's sometimes bycatches. And then if there's an effect on the habitat or the ecosystem, and then just the management of the fishery. So these all go into play when they make these seafood guides. Now on the aquaculture side, which is what we're going to focus on, continue to focus on today, is the use of marine resources, such as fish meal and fish oil, and we're going to talk more about that. If the fish are in pens, are they escaping into the wild? Is there a risk of transfer of disease to wild fish? Is there pollution or habitat effects, and also management of aquaculture? So here's the seafood guide again. Fish to eat. These are fish with caution or good alternatives, and then fish to avoid. So we're going to focus on one particular fish today, salmon. Salmon is in the fish to avoid. And I want to explain to you all why that is and how you can still eat salmon, but you'll know what you need to do to determine what's the best salmon to eat. So let me give you a little bit more information. First of all, farmed salmon, and that's Atlantic salmon, along with trout, is about 14% of all the world trade of seafood. It's a very high commodity in the world because it is 1.9 million tons of Atlantic salmon or trout is produced. And 99% of all of the Atlantic salmon on the market is farmed salmon. So 50% of all the salmon, you're talking sockeye, coho, et cetera, 50% of all the salmon on the market is Atlantic salmon. And the largest suppliers are in Norway, Chile, Scotland, Canada, and the US. This is where the big net pens are located around the world. And so these are some of the reasons why salmon is probably the most controversial species out there. And I probably get more questions about salmon than any other fish. So that's why I chose to focus in on that today. So there's potential issues with contaminants, net pans, escapees, feeds, and potential nutrient, chemical pollution, and habitat effects. So we're going to cover those. But let's get cooking. Brian, where are you? Let's go. He's going to project this up on the screen so you can see what's going on. And we need some dinner music in here. Actually, what did I, oh, there it is. Okay, so we're going to make poached salmon, and if you look at your, you don't have to read it now, but I just want to let you know that I did leave the recipe book with you. Oh, not the book, but you know, the pages, the recipes. And so we need a little bit of water. We're going to poach it. A little bit of water. Some lemon. Okay, and just a touch of tamari, which is a gluten-free product. You've got soy and you've got tamari, so I've chosen tamari here in case anybody is interested in gluten-free. Okay, so turn the stove on, get that going. Okay, so while that's heating up, I want to show you the salmon here. Can we see it good? Okay, is this wild or farmed salmon? Who says wild? Anybody say wild? It's farmed salmon. Okay.
How can you tell?
I'm going to tell you that. Great question. Oh, I planted you in the audience to ask that, didn't I? How can you tell? The way you can tell is that wild salmon is darker. Farmed salmon is lighter. Wild salmon is leaner. Wild salmon is leaner. Farmed salmon has more fat content. The wild salmon have a lot of exercise. Not that the farmed salmon don't. They do swim around in their pen, but they don't have to go looking for their food because their food is supplied to them. It's the fats in both the wild and the Atlantic that's so important to our health. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. The farm salmon actually has a pigment. The canthaxanthin is added to color the salmon. That's the same coloring that they use in chickens to make the chicken skin slightly yellow and also to make the eggs look richer. It is a natural pigment. It's found in carrots. And it's, the amount that they use in the feed is 10 times lower than the acceptable level. So there's no health concerns there. And, oh, it's boiling good. OK, so we're going to take the salmon. And you can see the lines in here of the fat. You can also see that I had the skin removed. And I'm going to tell you why in a minute. So I'm going to put the salmon in here. And I like to cut it in a couple pieces. That way it will cook a little more evenly. And I'm going to turn it down. Well, maybe not that much. We want a little boil going. OK, while that is cooking, I need to keep track of time too. While that's cooking, we're going to talk more about salmon. So these are the benefits of eating salmon. The omega-3s that's in fish is really healthy for you. It's an essential, which means that you need it for your body, but your body doesn't make it. So by eating fish and also things, it's actually in flaxseed, it's in walnuts, it's in vegetables, but it's the highest amount is found in fish, and it's the most absorbable and digestible form of it. So it does help with heart disease, and it helps with reducing cholesterol, lowers blood pressure, reduces inflammation, and it's really good for your brain, eyes, skin, joints, and immune system. So you can see how essential and how important omega-3s are. The doctors recommend that you eat seafood twice a week, and you eat about 4 to 6 ounces of seafood. And so that's the advantage there. So let's go back to this whole thing about contaminants, the PCBs. And Adam, what's that? Polychlorinated biphenyls. OK. And so do you all remember when there was like a big to-do about that in the paper? And everybody said, whoa, I'm not going to eat salmon anymore. That's it. There's too much contaminants in there. Well, if you look at this, you can see that salmon is right there, 26 parts. So let me explain that the legal tolerance limit in fish is 2,000 ppbs, parts per billion. That's like putting 1 part per billion is like putting a drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. 26 is very low. If you eat butter, you're eating more PCBs than salmon. So I hope I busted the myth and that you don't worry about contaminants. I'm not saying that they're not there, but they're there in very low amounts. And in some farms, they're actually taking the PCBs out of the fish oil that they're using and reducing the amount of PCBs down to, one farm has it down to 11 ppbs. So I just wanted to show that to you so that you could think about that. I also, while we're talking about fish meal and fish oil, there's a lot of controversy that aquaculture uses a lot of this in the feeds. To orient you to the graph here, this is the millions of tons of fish meal used. On the other side is the percentage of fish meal by the volume of the food itself. Okay, how much the percentage is. So what you can see is that back in the 1995, there was about 24%. There was a lot of fish meal used per amount of the diet, of the makeup of the diet. And so what's happened, though, is here we are in 2010. It's been reduced to 10%. And it's been further predicted to be reduced to 5%, which is great. What it means is that they found alternatives to fish meal and fish oil. They're using legumes like soy and corn and wheat. They're using different oils like palm oils and canola oils. And so this is helping to reduce the reliance on fish meal and fish oil to feed aquacultured fish. And, excuse me?
What is fish meal?
Fish meal is made from fish that's harvested from the sea. Thanks for asking that. So you might be wondering, well, gosh, aquaculture is using a lot of fish meal and fish oil from fish that's caught from the sea, but also pets, cats, other pets, and also pigs poultry industry is also using a fair amount of fish meal, fish oil. And I know a lot about our industry, that we're working really hard to reduce it. I'm sure that the other industries are too. So some of the issues with salmon in the net pens, I'm just going to take a quick sneak look here. Ooh, it's looking pretty good. So net pens are also very controversial for growing salmon. The location needs to be in deep water where there's a good flow, so it helps to dilute any of the nutrients. It shouldn't be located in a spawning run. It should be located outside of where salmon come in and do their spawning. There is issues with sea lice and viruses, and that's usually when there's problems with husbandry techniques. And so having good husbandry techniques is a way to avoid that. Also vaccines. And then escapees, they've come up with stronger and stronger materials for the nets. And there's lots more standards on the market. So I'd say overall that the industry is really improving. I'm not saying that all of the farms have, but I would say overall the industry is definitely improving in that. So in terms of improving, actually I'd just go, in terms of improving, the salmon that we're cooking today is from a place in Scotland called the Loch Duart. And it's a sustainable farm. It's one where they stock their fish at low density. They don't use growth hormones or antibiotics. They don't use genetically modified ingredients in their feed. They don't use any chemicals to keep the fouling down. Instead, the fish swim from one cage to another, and they bring up the nets and they let them dry. And they also do a fallow policy, where this is a site that's fallow. Like if they have 3 sites, they'll let one site go fallow for a year to let the environment come back. And they also use urchins to help graze the particulates and seaweeds to help pick up the nutrients. So it's really awesome to know about Scotland's farms. There are farms in Chile that are similar, and you can find a lot of this information on the internet. I do want to let you know that the salmon today was donated by Krabby Bill's, Indian River Seafood in Sebastian, and I put some of their cards out for you. All right, I think we need to check the salmon, actually. Well, you can be studying this slide while I do a little check here. You know that the salmon's done when it flakes easy, okay, and that it's the same color all the way through, and it's not there yet. So speaking about sustainability, here at Harbor Branch, we spend a lot of time working on sustainable systems, and I know that you've heard from Paul Wills and John Scarpa about our sustainable systems. We use tank systems on land, and so all the water is reused. We don't have a lot of effluent. We work with energy efficient systems. We use effluent to grow multiple species, and Paul talked a lot about that. And then we also have studied alternatives to fish meal. We have domestic breeding programs, and also we do a lot of teaching of these practices. So that's what we do here, and we've been very successful with this with pompano, with shrimp, with clams and oysters, and also seaweeds. All right, it says here we need to finish the salmon. So Brian, let's see if we can finish the salmon. Let's see if it's done. Let's take a look here. Oh, it's not done yet. Oh, actually, this piece is getting close to done. So you know what we're going to do? Just let this cook for a few more minutes. We're going to put the ingredients in the bowl so that we can put it all together when it's ready. Actually, we may want to, what's the next slide? Oh, seaweeds. I'll leave you with this. I'm hoping that somebody will make me this cake for my birthday, because I love seaweed. Do you all love seaweeds? Have you all eaten seaweeds? Yeah? You like seaweeds? Yeah. Like you probably eat seaweeds, like this? Is that right? Good. Yeah, when the Japanese sushi bars came to be, it was really great because the nori and also the seaweed salads, and there's these little snacks now that come, nori, you know, like wasabi flavor and yum yum. And they also like miso soup has seaweed in it. Yeah. So I'm going to zest. Do you guys like to zest? I love to zest. Okay, we need some zest for our salmon. It's really easy. You buy a zester and you get a nice lemon or lime. What you don't want to do is you don't want to go too deep, because if you go too deep, if you go too deep on the white, it'll be bitter. Okay. So we need a little lemon zest, and we need some dill. Okay, dill. Can you see me over here, okay? Yeah. Okay, we add a little dill. We're going to add some chives. We're going to add a little bit of mustard. And Vegenaise, it's an alternative to mayonnaise. It's all vegetarian. A little bit of that. And a pinch of salt. And a little bit of pepper. Oh.
What's the name of the vegetarian mayonnaise you use?
Vegenaise. Vegenaise. Yes, and it's written on your written on your recipe there. Okay, how are we doing on the fish? Should be done now. You think so? Anyway. Oh, see how it flakes off really nice? Right? Oh, it's beautiful. Okay, so this fish is done. I've already used that plate. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting my act together here. It's like this in our kitchen every day. Okay, ask my husband. Okay, we are going to take this fish and put it on the cutting board. Now, what I forgot to tell you when we were having the PCB talk is that the reason you take the skin off is because PCBs are found in the fat. And so if you take the skin off, that helps to get rid of some of the PCBs. And also, if you poach it, that's another way of getting it off. I know, the skin's good. Somebody said I like the skin. I understand that. Okay, so there's our salmon. Very good. All right, well, while I'm mixing that together, I'm going to we're going to move on so we keep everything on time. So what I'm going to do is just flake the salmon apart and mix it in with the ingredients. Okay? But what you would do at home is the salmon's hot now. It's quite hot. So you'd really want to cool it down. You'd want to flake it and cool it down and then mix in your ingredients. So we will do that before we're done today. But to keep on time here, I would like to introduce Dennis Hanasak, who all of you know. And he's going to talk. He's our resident expert, world-renowned phycologist and marine botanist, and he's here today to talk to you about seaweeds.
Thank you, Megan. Well, let's see. Here we go. So we know that people have used algae for food since prehistoric times, as far back as people lived by the ocean. They probably did a little grazing on the seaweeds. But in terms of aquaculture, the earliest records we have go back to about the 1600s. And seaweed culture actually originated in Japan. And initially it was for nori. And nori is that porphyra species, which is the wrapper of sushi that many of you have eaten. And the second one they used was a brown alga called kelp in our part of the world. They call it kombu. And initially, people would basically, at first, would just put out rock substrates in the intertidal zone because nori grows in the intertidal. And then they start to use basically fishing nets, again, just suspended with bamboo poles in the right part of the water column. And this is the way seaweeds were grown for several hundred years. And it really was not until the 1950s and 1960s that a lot of science got applied to seaweed biology. And in particular, a major advance for seaweed cultivation, especially nori, was understanding life histories or life cycles. And in particularly, there was a phycologist, a person who studies algae, who worked in Great Britain, and she found that what was the nori plant was actually had an alternate phase in its life history that was previously considered an entirely different genus, entirely different organism. And she found that actually the two of them alternated back and forth during the course of the year. She discovered that in culture. Sounds like a very obscure piece of information, very far away from Japan. But in fact, the Japanese realized very quickly that that was why they only got growth through part of the year of the nori, and they could control the life cycle. They started to grow this up in large greenhouses on land with proper temperature control, and they began to seed many more lines and ropes that basically totally superseded the old technology. The Japanese nori farmers built a statue in her honor. It's the only algal person, like my discipline, that I know of in the world that has any kind of statue. So I've gone to Japan twice and haven't seen the statue, but someday I will go just to see the statue. She never went to Japan. She worked just in her lab, but it was probably one of the biggest breakthroughs for seaweed aquaculture. And I think it's a good example of how fundamental science leads to applied science, which of course is what we do here at Harvard Branch a lot. The 70s and 80s were when we saw the greatest technological innovations in seaweed cultivation, and a lot of that was on the West Coast with Macrocystis, the giant kelp. Maybe some of you know, there used to be a very substantial harvesting operation of kelp off of Southern California, and that was started in World War I, actually, and proceeded for about 100 years. And that and the other major experimental site was here in Florida. This is at Harvard Branch, and this is basically why I first came to Harvard Branch. And I worked with John Ryther, who was a wonderful person. He was a very major figure in biological oceanography. Megan showed you that chart that said that in 1990, basically harvest from the fisheries plateaued off. John Ryther, 20 years before that, predicted not only that number, 90 million, but predicted the year, 20 years in advance. That's why he quit doing biological oceanography and studying the productivity of the ocean and went into aquaculture. And a lot of that work was why we are what we are today here at Harvard Branch in aquaculture. This ultimately led, the seaweed side of this ultimately led to the IMTA type work that you saw that Paul Wills talked about in January, where we use different types of organisms, as Megan mentioned earlier. And the ones that we found were most useful and most productive back in the 70s, such as seed lettuce, which is a very edible species, not only for humans, but also for, there you go, also for herbivores. So this is a really good thing to have an aquaculture system, and in nature, these are readily consumed by animals like fish and urchins that eat these green plants. And also the other one is Gracilaria. Gracilaria is a very important source of auger, commercially important throughout the world. And there's Paul, you may remember him, and now we are using both species in the IMTA system. The economic value overall is about 95% of all of our commercial seaweeds are cultivated. Of that, about 80% is used for food. Again, that may be surprising to you because we don't eat a lot of seaweeds in that fashion. But as you'll see, this enormous amount, 19 million tons wet weight, which has doubled in about the last 10 years, so it's definitely a growth industry. It has a value of almost $6 billion throughout the world. The reason we don't know so much about it is all this activity is mostly in the Orient. And in fact, of that amount, 98% of that production is in China, which has about 60% of the production here. Indonesia, which is rapidly expanding, went from very little 20 years ago to 20% of the world market now. The Philippines, which is 10%. Korea, both north and south, is about 7 or 8%. And Japan, which was the initial leader, is only about 2 or 3%. But almost all that is nori, and that's what they're best known for. So most of the way people culture is not the way we do it here in tanks on land, but they do it much more extensively. They take up a lot of space. Usually directly in the water, near shore, in embayments, something that would be very difficult to do politically and socially in the United States. And every time it's been proposed, it actually hasn't gotten off the ground. So you can see a lot of this is still kind of the traditional ways of seeding lines, and a lot of it is done. You saw some of the folks there. They basically are fishermen who kind of do this when they're not fishing. And oftentimes it's done at the family level. They don't get paid an awful lot of money. The ones who make the money are the middleman. They're very large seaweed companies. It's a very small group. It's quite the cartel. If you think OPEC's a cartel, you should see the seaweed industry. It's very tightly controlled by just a few companies. And with that, I grow seaweeds. I know nothing about cooking or eating them. And I pass the baton back to our lead speaker.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Okay, so this is a photograph of sugar kelp that's grown in Maine. A colleague of mine grows it as part of his mussel and oyster work that he does in Penobscot Bay. And this is his daughter and a friend, and the sugar kelp is out drying. Maine is a big distributor of seaweeds or sea vegetables. And there's a group called the Maine Coast Sea Vegetables Company. I have their website is on your recipe sheet. And I found a very nice short video to show you of how they harvest the seaweeds. I've been buying seaweeds from them for many, many years now. So I wanted to show you this video.
It's gorgeous up here. You'll never see anything, you know, in the water other than what belongs there.
The north coast of Maine is the scenic backdrop for a rare kind of harvest.
You see that nice honey-colored right up through here?
The crop here is seaweed, and for nearly 2 decades now, Ron Hinkle has made a living carefully pruning the plants in these waters.
It's kind of like, you could think of it kind of like a garden. Is the more I cut it and keep it cleaned and nipped up, the better, and the better the seaweed is every year. You know, it's better and better.
It comes and goes by names like digitata, laver, dulce, and bladderwrack. As many as 8 types of seaweed are native to this stretch of the Atlantic coast.
Last year we harvested 100,000 pounds of this stuff to get 10,000 dried pounds at the end. That's a lot of work too, you know.
Hinkle does the heavy lifting, but it was the failing health of this man's wife that turned these sea vegetables into a business.
We discovered it one day at a picnic down by the beach.
Seaweed was one of the dietary changes suggested for his wife, but imported seaweed was costly. So Chef Earhart took a chance on sea vegetables from the waters of Maine.
Luckily, somebody said, well, you know, why don't you change your diet and see what happens? And we started eating seaweed, and it made all the difference.
This admitted hippie of the 60s pioneered drying techniques and sold his first batches by word of mouth in brown paper bags. As the business grew, Maine Coast Sea Vegetables found itself shipping seaweed across the U.S. and overseas.
But the seaweed became more of a passion when we realized that there are a lot of people in the cities who don't have access to this that really appreciate it and find it a vital part of their diet.
Asian countries have touted the benefits of seaweed for thousands of years, and many who consume sea vegetables claim significant health benefits.
So that's a very interesting story about the seaweeds. And today what we're going to do is cook with one of the seaweeds from Maine Coast Sea Vegetables. Brian, would you mind coming back? Thanks. It's called dulse. It's a great, very tasty seaweed. You can eat it raw, or I'm going to show you actually how to make it crispy. And if you like, who likes bacon? Or maybe you don't want to admit it. But you can actually replace bacon with dulse. It's really nice, it's really crispy, and it has a lot of great flavors. So that's the dulse there. So what I did is I broke it up. You can see it's got this beautiful sort of purplish color to it. So I broke it up into small bite-sized pieces.
How do you spell it?
D-U-L-S-E, dulse. And you take a little bit of olive oil and heat it. I like to use a heavy pan like this cast iron pan. You heat the oil, and it really only takes like a couple minutes at the most. While that's heating up, I wanted to show you what we did with the salmon. I flaked up the salmon, right? And what I'm going to do is just mix in the ingredients that we put together a little earlier. And that should finish that dish up. And just mix it in very gently. It makes it very nice and creamy. One of my favorite ways to eat salmon, so you can eat it on a sandwich, or you could eat it, in this case we're going to put it on a bed of romaine lettuce. You can have it with crackers. But it's nice and moist and full of those rich omega-3s, and it's from a sustainable farm in Scotland. Okay, actually before I do that, let me see if the oil is hot enough. Okay, so we're going to put the dulse in there, like that. It's getting hot. Not quite there yet. So when it starts to turn to a golden brown color, that's when you know it's ready. Oh, yes, that's on one of my slides. Well, we're cooking right now, but what we're going to do is okay, these are my favorite seaweeds. I think it's the next slide. Okay, we'll advance. There we go. Those are all of some of the benefits of eating seaweeds. Seaweeds, it's interesting because our blood chemistry is very much like the ocean. And because seaweeds grow in the ocean, of course, they carry those minerals and nutrients that are similar to salt water. We eat them, and so it's very good for our blood, which is very good for us. So these are just a few of the things, like calcium, magnesium, potassium, iron, iodine, the whole alphabet here, along with protein. But it's richer in nutrients and minerals than your land plants because it's living in the ocean, picking up all those minerals. And so it's very, very good for you. I try to eat seaweed every day. You've got to be careful not to eat too much of it because it is so rich in minerals. So you don't want to overdo it. And the interesting thing about seaweed is that not in this case so much, but in the case where you're soaking the seaweed, it can expand because almost all the seaweeds come dry, just like that dulse did. Just like, here's some seaweeds. I store the seaweeds in glass. You don't have to, and they last for years and years and years and years. So.
Could you stop taking your vitamin pills?
You could. You could. Okay, so I gave you 3 websites where you can buy seaweed. And also, I noticed that Fresh Market now sells it, and you can buy it in just about any health food store. I know you guys are going to want to go home and make this immediately. Right? All right. So that seaweed is done. See how it turned from purple to kind of like a golden brown color? You don't want to cook it too much. You don't want to burn it. This is actually one of our son's favorite dishes that I make. Daniel, you here? Okay, he's over there. He's like, Mom, make me some dolls. So if my 17-year-old son loves it this much, I'm sure you will too. Okay, so there's the dulse, right? I'm going to keep it on the side because if it mixes in with the vegetables, it will go soft again. So there's our dulse. Okay, how are we doing on time? Are you guys okay that I'm running a few minutes late for dinner? Okay, I promise I'm almost done. We're going to do the watercress. Watercress is great. This is actually grown in Fellsmere. A watercress farm. They grow watercress, they grow arugula. You can buy it in Publix. And it's very, very high in iron and calcium because it's a green vegetable. So I'm not going to actually cook it very long because I don't like it to be too well done. So we're just going to cook that just a little bit with, you see I use the same pan as the dulse, so the yumminess of the dulse will kind of blend in with the flavors of the watercress. And I just added a little bit of water so it kind of will steam it a little bit. So put the lid on here. Meanwhile, we have our lemon infused jasmine rice. I cooked this ahead of time because I knew I wouldn't have time to cook it today with you, but it cooks really quickly. It cooks in like 15 minutes. I added the lemon and the lemon zest again while it was cooking with a little bit of salt. So this recipe, I'll work over here, Brian, so you can see it okay. How are we doing on the watercress? Okay, good. Okay, so if you read your recipes, or when you read your recipes, I had suggested to put in blanched carrots so it won't be too chewy or too crunchy. I mean, when I blanch these carrots, you blanch them for about a minute and a half. Just fill up a pot of water, turn it to boiling, put the carrot in for a minute and a half, take them out, and you've got beautiful blanched carrots. Going to add some peas that I also blanched. You can use frozen peas. If you don't like peas, maybe some of you don't, you can use corn. And then this is the arami. This is from Japan, and I cooked it for 15 minutes. And this is another really rich source of iron and iodine and calcium. So we're going to add that to the dish too. Oh, let's see how our watercress is doing. Okay, watercress done. See how quick it is? Got to keep an eye on that one. Okay, watercress is going on here. All right, we're starting to build our little springtime entree here. Here's the watercress. Little bit of sesame seeds, roasted sesame seeds, high in calcium. Okay, let's go back to the rice. See how beautiful that is? How many of you will eat this? Would eat this? All right, got some seaweed lovers here. I'm making you hungry, right? Yeah, sorry about that. Now you could add a little bit more to it. You could certainly have a little bit more seaweed in here. You can really mix it in according to your taste. And let's see, I'll use this spoon here. Put that on there. Okay, we're going to add a few slices of radishes, tomato, and I didn't have time to cut the cucumber, but cucumber would have gone on next. But I don't know if any of you eat sunflower sprouts. Put a few sunflower sprouts on there, and there's our entree. Excuse me? Oh, the dolls. Well, you know what? I kept it on the side because it's crunchy, and if I start putting it on the dish, like you can put it on the dish now. As soon as you're ready to eat, you can use it as a condiment. So you can take it and just sprinkle it, or you can just eat it right out of the bowl. Okay? Because I wanted it to stay crispy, I decided to keep it on the side. All right, let's see what else I might have left off. Jill, could you go back 2 slides for me, please? Yeah, that's it. I just wanted to introduce you very briefly to some other of my favorite seaweeds. Nori, that you all know about. That's what also Dennis was talking about. It comes in these wonderful sheets. And sometimes I'll just sit at the table and I'll take a piece like this and I'll fold it in half and I'll say, Daniel and Gary, would you like some seaweed with your dinner? And so I might take a square just like this and take a little bit of rice, put the rice in the middle, and then just roll it up and eat it. So you don't have to go out to sushi to have sushi at home, and you don't need a lot of fancy things to make that happen. The other thing is we talked about the dulse. The wakame is what they put in miso soup. It's also seaweed salad. The kelp or kombu, which we saw the video on, comes in very long strips. I cut it up into little postage stamp size. I use this to cook beans with. It helps the beans to be more digestible. And the arami we talked about. There's another seaweed called sea palm that you can put into a vegetable stew. And then the agar-agar, best kept secret. It's flakes made from red algae. Instead of using gelatin to make a jello, you can actually make a jello with the agar-agar flakes. Oh, I forgot to tell you, this is one easy way that you can make, add seaweed to your meal, is you can buy it already dried and granulated. Kelp granules and dulse granules. So you can sprinkle that on your vegetables, on your rice, and it's just incredible, the nutrients in these little packets here. So you can get those from Maine Coast Sea Vegetables or at your local health food store. We talked about that. So the next time you're at a seafood counter and you're wondering what to buy, or you're at a restaurant wondering what to buy, I hope that this presentation that we gave you today gave you some valuable information, and that you also collect a seafood card on your way. And I wanted to let you know that there's also some websites that we put on your recipe sheet. There's an iPhone app that Monterey Bay Aquarium has put out if you want that. You can go to the seafood market and you can find out on the labels where your food comes from. So that's another way. And there's a lot of certifications of sustainable seafood, so you can ask if it's been certified. And I just wanted to let you know that the Florida aquaculture license plate helps to support the research we do at Harbor Branch. And that if you want to learn more about aquaculture, we do have an upcoming workshop. It's a 2-day workshop. So there's more information on our website on that. And I'm going to leave you with this quote, and I'm going to ask Dennis if we have time for maybe a couple of questions, do you think? Okay. This quote is by Julie Packard, who's with Monterey Bay Aquarium. All right, well, it's been a real pleasure working and talking with you all today about healthy seafood choices. So thank you very much, and now we'll open up for questions.